Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into Azure SQL with the help of Bob Ward's book, Azure SQL Revealed, the next-generation cloud database with AI and Microsoft Fabric, 2nd edition.
This deep dive's really going to give you all the key insights, whether you're prepping for a meeting or just want to brush up on Azure, or hey, maybe you're just super curious about the future of databases.
We're excited to unpack the core concepts and new features and really dig into what all this means for using Azure SQL in a world that's increasingly driven by AI and the cloud.
Especially since the first edition of this book, it's wild to see just how much Azure SQL has changed. Bob Ward has been right there through it all, seeing SQL Server make its way to the cloud. His insights are just amazing.
Absolutely. This deep dive is all for you, our listener. We're going to break it all down. Core concepts, new stuff, what it means for you if you're trying to use Azure SQL in this crazy world of AI and cloud computing.
So first things first, who is Bob Ward? What's so special about what he brings to the table?
Well, he's not just an author. Bob's a principal architect at Microsoft, and Azure SQL is his jam.
You can tell how dedicated he is just from his writing. I mean, he even dedicated this whole book to everyone who made the jump to Azure. You can tell he cares about this stuff actually being used in the real world.
I love that. Basically, he wants to empower people, not just talk theory.
For sure. And the cool thing is, he's super practical, but he doesn't skimp on getting everything right. Anna Hoffman, a big name at Microsoft, talks about this in the foreword. She worked closely with him and saw firsthand how meticulous he is about every single detail.
Oh yeah, he's known for that.
Yeah.
But somehow, he still manages to explain all this complex stuff in a way that's clear and understandable. Not everyone can pull that off.
I know, right? It's a gift. He skips all the jargon and goes straight for the good stuff. The way he breaks down how SQL Server transformed into Azure SQL is a masterclass in explanation.
This book really does tell the whole story, starting way back in the beginning. I bet it wasn't always an easy road, was it?
Oh, definitely not. The book goes deep into all the hurdles they faced right from the start with CloudDB. Think about it. They were taking tech meant for physical servers and trying to reinvent it for the cloud.
That's a huge leap. They had to figure out how to keep the best parts of SQL Server, its reliability and security, while taking advantage of all the cloud has to offer, like being able to scale up or down easily.
Exactly. The book highlights these big milestones, like Project Socrates. It was a monster project, all about moving away from physical servers and embracing the cloud. And then there was the Sawa project, which pushed them towards a whole platform as a service model.
I bet there were some bumps in the road, like the noisy neighbor problem, where one database can actually mess up the performance of others sharing the same resources.
Oh, and don't forget the whole issue of making T-SQL more open to developers while keeping everything super secure and isolated for each tenant.
They really overcame a lot. One thing I found really cool was how the book talks about the people behind all this tech. It's not just code, it's the people who wrote it, their choices, what they learned along the way.
Such a good reminder that tech is driven by people in the end. Which brings us to something important. Azure SQL isn't just a database anymore. It's so much more than that now. It's a whole platform.
So let's say you're new to Azure SQL. What are the different options out there? What's the landscape look like?
Well, there's a whole spectrum. You get to choose the level of control and convenience you want. There's IaaS infrastructure as a service. Basically, it's SQL Server running on virtual machines in the cloud. Microsoft handles the infrastructure, but you're in charge of the SQL Server instance.
Then there's PaaS platform as a service, right? Like Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database.
Yep. PaaS is where Microsoft handles more on the back end, so you can focus on your data and your applications. It's all about picking the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And the cool thing about Azure SQL is that it can handle all sorts of needs and scales. It can grow with you.
Here's what's really wild. Azure SQL is now beyond RDBMS. It's not just rows and columns anymore. There's stuff like JSON support, so you can work with more flexible data structures. It's even got graph database stuff for modeling relationships and spatial data types for when you're dealing with location data.
This is where it gets really interesting for our listener. Why is this beyond RDBMS approach so important now?
Think about how data is being used now. It's not just neat little spreadsheets. We've got social networks, location data from phones, sensor data from the Internet of Things, and complex JSON documents flying around from web APIs. It's messy.
Having a platform that can handle all of that and still be familiar to SQL users, that's pretty powerful.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second edition of the book. Why should anyone working with or interested in Azure SQL pick this up?
Well, the second edition has been updated a lot. It's got the latest advancements in Azure SQL. But it's not just about adding new stuff. It's about a whole new way of thinking about how to use Azure SQL in a world that's being shaped by AI and the cloud.
What are some of the big changes that stand out to you? What really caught your eye?
Definitely the new chapters about AI and how it works with Microsoft Fabric. Microsoft Fabric is this unified analytics platform, and Azure SQL is going to play a huge role in it.
Yeah.
It's not just about storing data. It's about using AI to make that data work for you.
I'm curious about how AI is being integrated. How is Azure SQL actually incorporating AI, and what can developers do with it?
One of the coolest things is vector search being built directly into Azure SQL. Imagine turning words and ideas into mathematical fingerprints. That's what embeddings are. They let Azure SQL understand the meaning of your data, not just the words themselves.
Wow, that's awesome. Suddenly you can build applications that do semantic search, where they're actually understanding the meaning and context, not just looking for keywords.
Exactly. And that opens up so many doors. You can use it for crazy stuff like recommendation systems, finding similar documents or images, even building chatbots that actually get what you mean.
It's like giving your database a brain. And the book goes even further, talking about how you can use Azure SQL to store and manage all the data that goes into training and running these AI models. Azure SQL is becoming part of the AI ecosystem itself.
It's wild how far Azure SQL has come. And this second edition really pulls it all together. It shows how this platform is right at the cutting edge of data innovation.
It absolutely does. For anyone who wants to dive into Azure SQL, or even for experienced pros who want to stay ahead of the curve, this book is a must-read. It's full of practical insights, real-world examples, and a clear vision for how Azure SQL is shaping the future of data.
We've covered a lot here, but we're just scratching the surface of what Bob Ward goes into in Azure SQL Revealed. Let's dive deeper into some of the specifics in the next part of our deep dive. So we've talked about Azure SQL becoming this powerhouse platform, especially with all the updates in the second edition of Bob's book. It seems like Azure SQL isn't just keeping pace, it's actually shaping the future of data. And one of the ways it's doing that is with AI.
Totally. And one place where you really see this is in building APIs with Azure SQL. The book talks about this tool called the Data API Builder, DAB for short. And it sounds like a total game changer for anyone who wants to use their Azure SQL data with other apps.
DAB definitely stands out in this second edition. What's cool is how it makes creating APIs so much easier. APIs are basically the messengers that let different software systems talk to each other and swap information, right?
Yeah, they're like the translators of the digital world, so apps that speak different languages can still work together.
Exactly. And making APIs used to be pretty hard. You needed special skills and a lot of code. But DI changes all that. It's got this visual interface where you basically drag and drop to make your API endpoints. You pick what data you want to share, set of security, the whole 9 yards.
Like building with digital Lego blocks. Suddenly, anyone can build APIs, even if they're not coding wizards.
For sure. And get this, DIB works with both REST and GraphQL, two of the most popular API formats. So you've got options for how you design and structure your APIs.
For our listeners who aren't familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of REST and GraphQL? What's the difference, and why would you choose one over the other?
Sure. REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer. It's like a set of rules for how systems talk to each other over a network, like a structured conversation. GraphQL, though, is more like asking very specific questions to get just the data you need. It's really efficient.
So REST is like the set menu at a restaurant, and GraphQL is like ordering a la carte, picking exactly what you want.
Great analogy. And with DIB, you get to pick the best way to do it. But, of course, security is always a big deal with APIs, right?
Yeah.
How does DIB handle that?
Security is huge, especially when you're sharing sensitive data through APIs. I was impressed with how DIB makes security part of the design process from the get-go. You can use API keys, like special passwords for each client that needs access. It even supports OAuth 2.0, the industry standard for secure authorization.
Think of OAuth 2.0 like a valet key for your data. You're giving limited access, but you're not handing over your main login info. Much safer.
And DIB makes it simple to set up all these security features. It walks you through it and makes sure your APIs are locked down tight.
This is a total game changer for developers. It makes Azure SQL a real powerhouse for building secure APIs. All sorts of possibilities open up for connecting your data to other applications and services.
It really does. And this whole focus on APIs, it's part of a bigger trend we're seeing in tech, this move toward microservices and serverless architectures. Azure SQL, with tools like DIB, is right there on the leading edge.
And speaking of leading edge, we can't ignore how deeply Azure SQL is getting involved with AI. We talked about vector search and how it lets Azure SQL understand the meaning of data, not just the words. But there's so much more to it than that.
There is. One of the most exciting things is being able to create embeddings right inside Azure SQL. Embeddings, they're like translating words, ideas, even whole documents into numbers that capture what they mean and how they relate to each other.
Like giving your data a special fingerprint that shows its essence, a fingerprint that AI algorithms can use to understand and analyze it in completely new ways.
Exactly, and the book explains how you can use these embeddings for things like semantic search, recommendation systems, even AI chatbots that get natural language.
Like Azure SQL is becoming fluent in the language of AI. Now it can be part of this whole new world of intelligent applications and services.
And that connects to another fascinating part of the book, how Azure SQL fits into generative AI. Generative AI is all about using AI models to create new stuff. Text, images, code, you name it.
Like having an AI artist or writer at your beck and call. But these generative AI models need mountains of data to learn, and they spit out a ton of output that you have to store and manage somehow. That's where Azure SQL comes in.
Right. Azure SQL, with its powerful data management capabilities, is the perfect platform for handling all that data. It can store the training data the models use, manage the output they create, and you can even use it to query and analyze that output to get insights and make the models better.
So Azure SQL is basically becoming the backbone of generative AI, providing the infrastructure and tools to support this whole rapidly growing field.
It's amazing to see Azure SQL being used for such cutting-edge stuff. But let's not forget, all this tech is built on a solid foundation of database know-how. The book digs into the more traditional side of Azure SQL too, like deployment options, security, performance tuning, best practices, the works.
It's a complete guide to managing your Azure SQL setup, whether you've got a single database or a huge enterprise deployment. And even those topics, which could be pretty dry, they're actually engaging because of Bob's writing style. He explains complex stuff clearly and simply, uses real-world examples, even throws in a little humor.
It's like having your own Azure SQL tutor. And one thing that really stood out to me is how he focuses on the why behind the what. He doesn't just tell you how to do something, he explains why it matters and how it fits into the bigger picture.
That's what you need to really get a technology like Azure SQL. It's not just memorizing commands, it's about understanding the principles behind it. And that helps you make better decisions, solve problems better, and get more out of Azure SQL.
Absolutely. And this book gives you that deeper understanding. It gives you what you need to not just use Azure SQL, but to master it.
So for someone who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all this, where do they even begin? What's the first step on the road to mastering Azure SQL?
Well, the book itself is a great starting point. It's like a roadmap to the whole world of Azure SQL. It walks you through everything, the basics, the advanced stuff. It gives you a strong foundation. And don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. Microsoft has a free trial for Azure, so you can play around with Azure SQL, try out the features we talked about, and see just how powerful it is.
And the Azure SQL community is amazing, super vibrant and helpful. There are tons of online resources, forums, blogs where you can connect with other pros, ask questions, share what you know, and learn from each other.
It's like having a global network of mentors and collaborators right there at your fingertips. And don't forget Bob Ward's blog and the resources he provides. He's really involved in the community, always ready to help.
It's awesome to see someone at his level so dedicated to sharing and empowering others. And that's something we strive for here at the Deep Dive too. We believe learning is a team effort, and we're glad you're on this journey with us.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Azure SQL, what are some key things you want our listener to think about as they keep exploring?
We've covered so much ground, from how Azure SQL has evolved to API development and its growing role in AI. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways our listeners should keep in mind as they keep digging into this platform?
What really struck me is how incredibly broad Azure SQL has become. It's not just a relational database in the cloud anymore. It's a versatile platform that can handle all sorts of data challenges. Building traditional apps, diving into AI, working with data that doesn't fit neatly into rows and columns, Azure SQL can handle it.
It's like Azure SQL is this toolbox filled with specialized tools for any data task you can imagine. And the new features in the second edition of Bob's book show how Azure SQL is always evolving to meet the changing demands of the data world.
For sure. And when we think about the future of data and where Azure SQL fits in, there's this one thing that's both exciting and kind of daunting. The rise of citizen developers.
Citizen developers.
Yeah. They're people who may not be trained software developers, but they can build apps using low-code or no-code platforms. And tools like the Data API Builder, which we talked about, are making Azure SQL more and more accessible to these new developers.
It's amazing to think that someone with a great idea but not a lot of coding experience could use Azure SQL to build a data-driven app. It really opens up access to data and could lead to a ton of innovation.
Totally. And it goes back to what Bob emphasizes about the human element of technology. He sees a future where more people, not just tech experts, can use data to solve problems, create solutions, and make the world better.
That's a powerful vision. And it's one that Azure SQL, with its focus on evolving and accessibility, is in a great position to make happen. But all this power comes with responsibility, right? We've touched on security throughout our deep dive, but it can't be overstated how important security is in this interconnected world we live in.
Absolutely. Security is not something you add on at the end. It has to be part of every aspect of your Azure SQL deployment, from the network to your apps and APIs.
The good news is Azure SQL has a lot of features to help protect your data. Things like virtual networks, network security groups, and private endpoints to control who can access your network.
Plus, there's Azure Active Directory integration, so you can use your existing systems for authentication and authorization.
Azure SQL also offers multiple layers of encryption, so your data is protected both at rest and when it's being transferred. And tools like Azure Defender for SQL keep an eye out for threats and monitor everything, helping you stay ahead of potential attacks.
It's like having a whole team of security specialists working behind the scenes to protect your data. And Bob's book goes into all these security details, giving practical advice and best practices for building a secure Azure SQL environment.
It's a must-read for anyone working with Azure SQL. Security is everyone's responsibility.
Definitely. And just like security is a shared responsibility, so is performance optimization. We've talked about different aspects of performance tuning during this deep dive, from picking the right service tier to indexing strategies and using features like intelligent query processing.
It's a complex challenge. Bob's book provides a complete framework for understanding and optimizing Azure SQL performance. He stresses that performance tuning isn't a one-time thing. It's a continuous process of monitoring, analyzing, and adjusting.
Like keeping a well-tuned engine running smoothly, you've got to keep checking those metrics, spotting any bottlenecks, and making tweaks to keep things running at peak efficiency.
The good news is Azure SQL has a bunch of tools and features to help you monitor and optimize performance. You've got Azure Monitor, which gives you a big picture view of your Azure environment. And tools like SQL Server Management Studio let you dive deep into the performance data of your Azure SQL deployments.
It's like having a performance dashboard right at your fingertips. With the right knowledge and tools, you can make sure your Azure SQL deployments are fast and responsive, just what your apps need.
Speaking of speed and responsiveness, we can't wrap up without mentioning one of the most exciting areas of Azure SQL, how it's being integrated with serverless computing.
Serverless computing is all about not having to manage the underlying infrastructure. So you can just focus on your code and logic, no need to worry about servers and VMs.
It's magic. You just write your code, deploy it, and Azure takes care of the rest. It scales your resources as needed. It's a perfect match for Azure SQL.
Totally. Azure SQL's serverless offerings mean you can have a database that scales automatically based on how much work it's doing. You only pay for what you use, no wasted money on idle capacity.
It's a game changer, especially for apps with unpredictable traffic. Your database just adapts to your needs, growing or shrinking as your workload changes.
This all ties back to the bigger trend of cloud-native development, where apps are built from the ground up to take advantage of the cloud's flexibility, scalability, and pay-as-you-go model. And Azure SQL is right there at the forefront, giving developers the tools they need to build truly cloud-native applications.
It's a great time to be working with Azure SQL, and Bob Ward's book, Azure SQL Revealed, is the perfect guide for anyone starting out on this journey.
It's got everything from the basics to the really advanced stuff, practical insights, real-world examples, and a clear vision of how Azure SQL is shaping what's possible with data.
As you continue exploring Azure SQL, remember what Bob's so passionate about: the community. Connect with other Azure SQL pros, share what you know, ask questions, and learn from each other. The Azure SQL community is incredibly vibrant and supportive, a great resource for anyone working with this platform.
We hope this deep dive has given you a taste of all that Azure SQL can do. It's a platform that's constantly evolving, pushing the limits of what we can do with data. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing your own boundaries with data-driven creativity. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.